Douglas Harper lived by numbers, and numbers never lied. His office on the third floor of Meridian Insurance smelled like coffee and paper, exactly the way he liked it. For 15 years, he'd calculated risk and assessed liability without a single surprise. Today started like any other Tuesday. His coffee maker gurgled in the background as he opened his email and found the new assignment waiting. Review historical records from a Louisiana leper colony for potential liability assessment. Standard work, maybe a little unusual, but nothing that would disrupt his ordered world. The box arrived an hour later, water-damaged cardboard held together with packing tape. Douglas cut it open and pulled out 3 leather-bound ledgers from the 1800s. The smell hit him immediately. Old leather mixed with something faintly medicinal that made his nose wrinkle. He set them on his desk between the spreadsheets and actuarial tables. The largest ledger felt heavier than it should as he opened the cover. Columns of names, dates, and calculations filled the pages in pristine condition, despite the book's obvious age. Douglas leaned closer. The ink appeared darker than it should be, almost wet. Douglas couldn't look away from the ledger. For 3 hours now, he'd been cross-referencing the death dates listed in those faded entries with historical death certificates from the county archives database. Every single prediction matched perfectly, down to the exact day. Hundreds of entries from the old leper colony between 1889 and 1923, and not one mistake. Not one. His hands trembled slightly as he verified another match, the blue glow of his computer screen mixing with the warm light from his desk lamp. This shouldn't be possible. He was an actuary, spent his entire career calculating probabilities and risk assessments, and this level of accuracy defied every statistical model he knew. Numbers had always made sense to him in ways people never did, especially after the divorce when Sarah told him he loved spreadsheets more than her. Maybe she'd been right, but at least numbers didn't lie or leave. They were predictable, safe, logical. But these numbers, these were something else entirely. Something that made his scientific mind buzz with equal parts excitement and dread. He reached for his coffee, now cold, and noticed the dark leather binding with its brass corners gleaming dully under the lamp. That's when he saw it. Pages at the back he hadn't noticed before, mostly blank except for 3 entries written in that same strange handwriting. Fresh ink. Dated within the last month. 3 names he didn't recognize. Yet. Douglas pulled out his phone with shaking hands and typed the first modern name into the search bar. The obituary appeared immediately on his screen. Margaret Patterson. Died on March 15th, 2019. The exact date written in the ledger. He searched the second name, then the third, his heart pounding harder with each result. All dead. All on the predicted dates, down to the very day. This wasn't possible. He stumbled back to the desk and opened the ledger again, turning pages with trembling fingers as he searched for some kind of explanation. The formulas scattered across the yellowed paper looked like nothing he'd ever seen in his 15 years as an actuary. They contained standard variables he recognized: mortality rates, health indicators, lifestyle factors, but mixed with symbols that made no sense. strange characters that seemed to calculate something beyond mere death statistics. Then he saw it happen. New ink began to form on the page right in front of his eyes. Dark letters slowly materializing out of nothing, bleeding through the paper like the page itself was alive. The scratching sound filled the silent office, and Douglas realized he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He watched in frozen horror as the calculations wrote themselves, mathematical formulas appearing line by line with deliberate purpose. His eyes drifted down the page until they found his own name, Douglas Chen. The formula beside it contained variables he understood at first: his cholesterol levels, his family's history of heart disease, his exercise habits. But then came the unknown symbols, strange marks that seemed to calculate something darker. Something about his soul. Douglas spent the next 3 days barely sleeping, diving into every record he could find about the Hansen's Disease Center. The old leper colony had a history darker than he'd imagined, buried under decades of medical progress and public relations. In the archives, he found references to an administrator from the 1920s named Silas Morgrave, a man whose methods bordered on inhumane even by the standards of that cruel era. Morgrave didn't see patients as people. He saw them as data points, statistics to be measured and tracked. He documented everything obsessively, recording each patient's decline in meticulous detail, calculating their deterioration like some kind of morbid accountant. But it got worse than that. Douglas discovered that Morgrave had become convinced he could predict the exact moment a soul left the body, believing death itself was a mathematical equation waiting to be solved. The administrator's journals, preserved in a university collection, contained page after page of calculations, formulas attempting to quantify the unquantifiable. He'd called it his great work, his divine calling to understand the moment between life and eternity. Reading those words made Douglas's skin crawl, but he couldn't stop, because somewhere in this madness was an answer to his own nightmare. The ledger sat on his desk now, back in his cold Rhode Island office that felt 1,000 miles from Louisiana's oppressive humidity. He'd tried everything to destroy the cursed thing over the past 2 days. Fire wouldn't touch it, the flames sliding away like the pages repelled heat itself. Water rolled off without leaving a trace of moisture. When he'd taken scissors to it, the blades simply glided across the surface as if the paper didn't exist in the same physical space as normal matter. The ledger was impossible, and it was killing him. His hands trembled constantly now, and he'd lost 12 pounds in a week, his body consuming itself according to some invisible timeline he couldn't escape. He carried the ledger everywhere, because leaving it behind felt worse somehow, like abandoning the evidence of his own death sentence. On the 8th day, Douglas found Morgrave's final entry in the administrator's personal journal, written just before the man disappeared without a trace in 1927. The words were precise and chilling. The ledger balances all accounts. Those found wanting in faith are calculated unto dust. Only mercy unmeasured can break the equation. Douglas stared at those words for a long time before opening the ledger to his own page again. The words beside his name had changed. They glowed faintly red now, pulsing like a heartbeat, and the number had decreased. 8 days remaining. Douglas stumbled back into Providence 3 days later, and he barely recognized himself in the reflection of his apartment window. Dark circles hung under his eyes like bruises, and his hands shook as he set the ledger on his kitchen table. He'd tried everything: consulted with mathematicians, visited libraries, even attempted to burn the cursed book in a parking lot. Nothing worked. The pages wouldn't catch fire, and his name stayed there, mocking him with its impossible equation. He was out of options, out of time, and out of strength. That's when he remembered the small church he passed every morning on his way to campus, the one with the white steeple and the wooden doors that always stood open. He'd walked by it hundreds of times without a second glance, but now it pulled at him like gravity. The interior was warm when he entered, lit by afternoon sun streaming through simple stained glass windows. It smelled like old wood and candles, so different from the sterile, calculating world he'd built around himself. An elderly pastor looked up from the front pew and smiled, not surprised at all to see a desperate man clutching a mysterious book. Douglas told him everything, expecting judgment or disbelief, but the old man just listened and then opened his Bible to Luke 17. 10 lepers, he said gently, all sick, all desperate, all healed by faith. Douglas looked down at the ledger sitting beside him on the pew, his name still glowing with that terrible equation. Jesus, he said, and his voice cracked like breaking ice. I can't solve this. I need you. I can't fight this alone. Tears fell onto the pages, and something impossible happened. The ink beside his name began to run and blur, dissolving like the variables no longer applied to him at all. Douglas looked down at his hands as the first rays of morning light came through the church windows. The strange marks on his skin were fading right in front of his eyes, like smoke disappearing in the wind. He opened the ledger one more time and found his name on the yellowed page. The calculations beside it were becoming illegible, the numbers blurring into nothing. He turned to the front of the book and stopped when he saw Morgrave's entry, the one that had been incomplete for over a century. It was finally resolving, the equation completing itself in ways Douglas couldn't understand. He realized something in that moment that changed everything. By accepting grace instead of calculation, he had broken the ledger's power over himself. The book couldn't measure what couldn't be earned. Later that afternoon, Douglas watched as the archive curator carefully sealed the ledger in a climate-controlled vault. His hands were steady now, completely unmarked, as he placed his palm against the glass. He spoke a quiet prayer of protection over it, knowing that some calculations were never meant for human hands. Douglas sat at his desk, where spreadsheets and probabilities once ruled his entire world. Now an open Bible rested beside his calculator, and the difference felt like night and day. He still calculated risks and analyzed data for his clients, but the numbers no longer controlled him with their promise of certainty. Sunday mornings found him in the third pew at Grace Community, surrounded by people who knew his story and accepted him anyway. He'd learned the hard way that friendship couldn't be measured in statistical models. A small card taped to his monitor read simply, "Some things cannot be calculated." Every time anxiety crept back in, every time he reached for control, he'd see those words and remember. Douglas learned that while we can calculate risk and measure probability, we cannot measure mercy. And in that unmeasured grace lies true freedom from fear.